A document survived that was never meant to become famous. For centuries, the fall of the Knights Templar was told as a clean story. Accusation, confession, judgment, destruction, heretics exposed, a dangerous order erased, case closed. Then, inside the Vatican archives, a parchment returned to the light. The Chinon parchment did not announce a grand conspiracy. It did something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. It suggested that the highest Templar leaders may have been absolved by the Pope himself, even as their order was still being pushed toward annihilation. That contradiction is where this story begins, not with buried treasure, not with secret bloodlines, not with the theatrical myths that later centuries loved to attach to the Templars. We begin with a record. Fragile, bureaucratic, inconvenient, and with the uncomfortable possibility that public history was made smoother than the reality behind it. Picture the Vatican archives not as a fantasy labyrinth, but as something more human. Shelves, catalogs, guarded routines, and documents that outlive the men who tried to control them. A parchment can be a dull object until it changes the shape of an old verdict. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The surviving record does not magically make the Templars innocent. It does not erase confessions, politics, fear, or the very real power their order had accumulated. What it does is force us to slow down, because sometimes the most revealing historical evidence is not the dramatic accusation shouted in public, but the quieter correction preserved where few people thought to look. Chapter 2. The Order Too Powerful to Ignore. To understand why the Knights Templar could be destroyed so spectacularly, we first have to understand why they mattered at all. They did not begin as bankers to kings. They did not begin as landowners spread across kingdoms, protected by papal privilege, admired by pilgrims, feared by rivals, and resented by men who owed them money. Their origin story was smaller, sharper, and easier to understand. A handful of knights, sworn to poverty and obedience, offering protection to Christian pilgrims traveling through the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. That beginning matters, because it gives the whole story its first contradiction. The Templars were warriors who took religious vows, men of the sword who promised to live like monks. In a medieval world that loved clear categories but rarely lived by them, this was a strange and powerful combination. They were not simply soldiers hired for a campaign, nor were they cloistered monks removed from violence. They occupied a space between battlefield and altar, and that made them fascinating from the beginning. Their full name was long and solemn: the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The name carried an image of humility and also a claim to sacred geography. The temple referred to their early headquarters near what Christians associated with the ancient Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Even before legends wrapped themselves around the order, the location gave the Templars an aura that was hard to separate from mystery. But their real strength came from something less romantic than relics or rumors. Organization. The Templars became powerful because they were disciplined, useful, and unusually well-connected. Across Europe, nobles donated land, money, mills, farms, vineyards, horses, and rights. Some gave out of genuine devotion. Some hoped to support the defense of the Holy Land. Some were thinking of their souls, which in the Middle Ages was not a small matter. A gift to a military religious order could feel like an investment in salvation, made in the very practical currency of property. Over time, these gifts formed a network: a commandery in France, another in England, holdings in Iberia, Italy, the German lands, and beyond. Each place did not merely sit there as a pious monument. It produced income. It stored goods. It supported recruitment. It moved resources. It connected local wealth to a transnational mission. That word, transnational, sounds modern, but it is useful here. The Templars did not belong neatly to one crown. They were tied directly to the papacy, and their privileges reflected that. They could enjoy exemptions from certain local taxes and authorities. They could cross borders with a freedom that ordinary people, and even many nobles, did not possess. In a Europe divided by kings, lords, bishops, and competing legal systems, the order functioned with a reach that looked almost unnatural. And wherever power does not fit easily into existing boxes, suspicion follows. At first, their rise could be admired. The Templars seemed to embody sacrifice. Their knights fought in the East. Their brothers in the West managed estates and supplies. Their reputation grew in the imagination of Christian Europe. Stern men in white mantles marked by the Red Cross, disciplined enough to fight, devout enough to die, and organized enough to keep doing both generation after generation. Yet admiration is not the same as affection. The more useful the Templars became, the more visible their wealth became. And the more visible their wealth became, the easier it was for critics to ask whether an order founded on poverty had become something else entirely. This is one of the most important things to hold in mind. The Templars were not hated because they were weak. They were vulnerable because they were strong. Their properties were too many to ignore. Their privileges were too broad to please local authorities. Their financial services placed them close to the anxieties of kings. Their reputation was grand enough that, when it cracked, everyone heard it. Their role in finance grew naturally out of their structure. Pilgrims and crusaders needed ways to move wealth safely across long distances. Carrying silver through hostile territory was an invitation to robbery, and medieval travel was rarely gentle. The Templars had houses across Europe and in the eastern Mediterranean. They had disciplined record-keeping, secure properties, and a reputation for reliability. From those ingredients came a practical system: deposits, transfers, loans, and credit arrangements that helped move money without always moving the money itself. It would be an exaggeration to call them a modern bank in the full sense. That kind of comparison can make the past look cleaner and more familiar than it was. But they did perform financial functions that made them indispensable. They held valuables. They handled payments. They lent money. They served rulers, nobles, pilgrims, and crusading enterprises. In an age when trust was fragile and enforcement could depend on swords as much as seals, the Templars offered something rare: institutional continuity. That continuity was part of their strength. It was also part of the resentment. A lord might die. A dynasty might stumble. A castle might change hands. But the order endured. It had rules, officers, records, and a mission that reached beyond one lifetime. For medieval rulers, this could be useful when the Templars served their needs. It could also be deeply irritating when the order's interests did not align with royal ambition. Imagine, for a moment, being a king with debts, enemies, and a constant need to convert authority into cash. Around you stands an order that is religious enough to claim moral protection, military enough to command respect, rich enough to tempt seizure, and international enough to resist easy control. You cannot simply treat it like an ordinary noble family. You cannot absorb it quietly. You cannot tax it like a town. And because it answers, in theory, to the Pope, attacking it openly requires more than appetite. It requires a story. That story had not yet been written, but the materials were waiting. The Templars' secrecy, for example, was not automatically sinister. Religious orders often had internal rules. Initiation rites, private discipline, and closed ceremonies were not unusual in themselves. But secrecy becomes dangerous when outsiders already distrust you. What looks like solemn tradition to members can look like concealment to enemies. What begins as discipline can be reinterpreted as conspiracy once political pressure demands a villain. Their military identity also carried a problem. The crusading movement had suffered grave setbacks. The dream of holding the Holy Land had dimmed. When Acre fell in 1291, the loss was not just territorial, it was psychological. Military orders that had justified their existence through the defense of crusader states now had to explain their purpose in a changed world. The Hospitallers adapted. The Teutonic Knights had their own frontier. The Templars remained powerful, wealthy, and famous, but their central mission looked less immediate than before. That gap between wealth and purpose is dangerous for any institution. When people believe an organization suffers for a sacred cause, they may forgive its riches as necessary. When the cause appears lost or distant, the same riches can begin to look like hypocrisy. The Templars still had defenders, and their service was not imaginary. But the moral atmosphere around them had changed. Their property seemed heavier, their exemptions more annoying, their independence less noble. This does not mean the order was doomed from the moment it became powerful. History is rarely that neat. The Templars survived for nearly 2 centuries because their power answered real needs. They were not a decorative relic of crusading romance. They were managers, fighters, diplomats, landlords, treasurers, and symbols. They stood at the crossroads of faith, war, money, and law. That is precisely why their fall could never be a small event. Destroying them would require more than arresting a few knights. It would mean breaking a network that stretched through Europe. It would mean turning admiration into suspicion, suspicion into accusation, and accusation into official memory. It would mean persuading people that the White Mantle and Red Cross had hidden corruption all along. And once that kind of story begins to harden, evidence has to struggle against momentum. The Templars were too powerful to ignore, but not powerful enough to protect themselves from a king who understood that institutions are vulnerable at the point where reputation meets need. Their wealth made them useful. Their privileges made them resented. Their secrecy made them easy to darken in the public imagination. Their loyalty to the Pope made them politically complicated. So before the arrests, before the interrogations, before the parchment that would later trouble the official story, there was this quieter reality. The order had become a giant built on vows of poverty, and giants in politics rarely fall by accident. Chapter 3. A king in debt. A church under pressure. Kings do not usually attack powerful religious orders because they wake one morning in a mood for scandal. They attack when a scandal becomes useful. By the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France stood at the center of a kingdom that looked strong from the outside and strained from within. He was not a foolish ruler. He was cold, disciplined, legally minded, and ambitious in the way medieval kings often had to be ambitious. Not only hungry for glory, but constantly pressed by the cost of turning royal authority into something real. Armies cost money. Officials cost money. Law courts, administration, diplomacy, fortifications, wars, ceremonies of power, all of it demanded revenue. A crown might appear sacred in public, but behind the solemn rituals was a very earthly problem. Someone had to pay. Philip's France was one of the great kingdoms of Europe, yet greatness did not make it financially comfortable. In fact, greatness often made the pressure worse. The more a king expanded the reach of his government, the more he needed systems to support it. The medieval state was becoming more organized, more legal, more demanding. Royal power was no longer only a man on horseback surrounded by nobles. It was clerks, seals, debts, taxes, courts, and written orders moving through the kingdom. That world suited Philip. He understood the force of paperwork almost as well as the force of soldiers. And that is part of what makes the Templar affair so chilling. It was not only an explosion of mob hatred or religious panic. It was organized. It was prepared in the language of legality. The accusations would be horrifying, but the machinery behind them was administrative. The king who moved against the Templars was a ruler who knew how to make violence look like procedure. Before the Templars became his target, Philip had already shown a willingness to confront powers that earlier kings might have treated more carefully. Most famously, his struggle with papal authority had brought him into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. The argument was not merely theological. It concerned the limits of power. Could the king tax clergy in his realm? Could the pope command obedience above royal authority? Where did spiritual jurisdiction end and political sovereignty begin? These may sound like dry constitutional questions, but in Philip's world, they were explosive. The church was not a quiet moral backdrop. It owned land. It collected revenue. It had courts, privileges, and claims that crossed borders. When a king needed money and obedience, those privileges could look less like holy protection and more like obstruction. Philip's conflict with Boniface VIII grew bitter, public, and humiliating. The Pope asserted spiritual supremacy. The king resisted. Royal agents and lawyers worked to weaken the Pope's moral standing. Accusations were deployed like weapons. The point was not simply to win an argument, but to shape the atmosphere in which the argument would be judged. This matters because it reveals a pattern. Philip did not need to defeat an institution only on the battlefield. He could also attack its legitimacy. He could surround a rival with suspicion, press legal charges, create a public narrative, and make resistance appear not noble, but criminal. Once that method had been tested against a pope, it was not difficult to imagine it being used against a religious military order. The papacy itself was also under strain. After Boniface, the church did not stand above politics like a mountain untouched by weather. It was entangled in the same storms. Pope Clement V, who would later face the Templar crisis, inherited a world in which the authority of the papal office had been damaged by confrontation with France. Clement was not simply sitting in Rome, free to judge from a distance. He was operating in a political landscape where French pressure was immediate and relentless. This does not mean Clement was merely Philip's puppet. History is rarely improved by turning complicated people into wooden figures. Clement had responsibilities, legal concerns, and his own sense of papal dignity. But he also had to survive the reality in front of him. The French crown was powerful. The accusations against the Templars, once released, would be almost impossible to ignore. And the Pope had to weigh not only truth, but scandal, order, and the fragile public authority of the Church. That is the uncomfortable setting in which the Templars became vulnerable. They were wealthy. They held property across France and beyond. They had served as financial agents and creditors. Their houses were known. Their brothers could be arrested. Their reputation was high enough to make their fall spectacular, and their independence was irritating enough to make their fall convenient. A weaker order might not have been worth the effort. A more ordinary enemy could have been punished without a continental drama. But the Templars offered something rare to a king in need, a target that was rich, symbolically charged, and difficult for the public to defend once the right accusations were attached to it. Here is where the story is often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine Philip as a man who simply wanted treasure, and in a crude sense that may point toward part of the truth. Money mattered. Debt mattered. Property mattered. But the deeper issue was control. Wealth without control is a temptation. Privilege without obedience is an insult. The Templars were not just sitting on assets. They represented a competing form of authority inside the kingdom, tied to the Pope and protected by religious prestige. To move against them, Philip needed more than greed. He needed moral permission. Heresy supplied it. In medieval Europe, accusations of heresy were not minor insults. They could strip away protection, isolate the accused, terrify witnesses, and transform political aggression into sacred duty. Once a person or an institution was successfully marked as heretical, ordinary sympathy became dangerous. To defend the accused could make you suspect. To hesitate could look like weakness. To ask careful questions could be treated as complicity. This is why the charges against the Templars were so devastating. They did not merely accuse the order of being corrupt or arrogant. They attacked its spiritual identity at the root. If the Templars were guilty of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshiping idols, or conducting obscene rites, then their entire public image collapsed. The warrior monks would no longer appear as flawed servants of a holy mission. They would appear as a hidden contamination inside Christendom itself. The brilliance and the danger of such accusations is that they reverse the meaning of secrecy. Every closed door becomes suspicious. Every internal ritual becomes evidence. Every silence becomes confession waiting to happen. And yet, before we follow the story into the arrests and interrogations, we should pause over the timing. By 1307, the Templars were no longer standing at the height of crusading glory. The Holy Land had largely been lost to Latin Christendom. The military orders still existed, still possessed wealth, still claimed purpose. But their old mission was harder to see from a village in France or a royal court calculating debts. A once heroic institution had become easier to question. Philip did not create every doubt surrounding the Templars out of nothing. That would be too simple. Powerful institutions accumulate enemies. They disappoint people. They protect themselves poorly. They inspire rumors precisely because they are not transparent. But Philip's genius, if that is the right word for something so ruthless, was to recognize that scattered suspicion could be gathered, sharpened, and made official. A rumor in a tavern is noise. A rumor in the hands of a king's lawyers can become a weapon. So the moment approached with a terrible kind of logic. A financially strained crown. A papacy still recovering from political bruising. A religious order rich in property, shielded by privilege, burdened by secrecy, and no longer protected by the full glow of crusading success. None of these elements alone destroyed the Templars. Together, they created the conditions in which destruction could be presented as purification. That is the darker lesson beneath the legal language. Institutions rarely fall only because they have enemies. They fall when their enemies find a story that enough people are prepared to believe. For Philip IV, the story was almost ready. Chapter 4, Friday the 13th. Before dawn on October 13th, 1307, the trap closed. Across France, royal officers moved almost at the same time. They carried sealed orders. They knew where they were going. They knew whom to seize. The targets were not rebels gathering in the open, not an army forming against the crown, not foreign agents slipping through a border. They were the Knights Templar, men who had prayed under the protection of the Church, managed estates, held accounts, guarded reputations built over nearly 2 centuries, and believed, perhaps fatally, that papal privilege still meant safety. The date would later acquire a strange afterlife. Friday the 13th became attached, in popular imagination, to bad luck and ominous coincidence. The connection is often overstated, and the superstition has a more complicated history than one medieval police action. Still, it is hard to resist the shape of it. A Friday morning, a kingdom-wide arrest, an order built on holy vows suddenly treated as a hidden enemy. Some dates do not need legend to feel heavy. Philip IV's move was not improvised. That is the first thing to notice. The arrests were coordinated with a level of planning that reveals the nature of the attack. This was not a spontaneous outburst of religious outrage. It was not a mob panic spreading from town to town. It was a royal operation, prepared in advance, conducted through administrative channels, and wrapped in the language of urgent moral necessity. That combination is what gave it force. A king who merely steals looks like a thief. A king who claims to cleanse the faith can present himself as a guardian. The genius of the operation was that political seizure and religious accusation arrived together. The officers did not simply take men into custody, they took control of the story at the same moment. The Templars were not allowed to appear first as victims of royal ambition. They were introduced to the public as suspects in a spiritual crime. This matters because reputation, once damaged in the right way, becomes almost impossible to defend. If the accusation had been ordinary corruption, the Templars might have answered with records, witnesses, and allies. If the charge had been bad management, they might have negotiated. If Philip had openly announced, "I need money, and they have it," even his own supporters might have shifted uneasily in their seats. But heresy was different. Heresy changed the air around the accused. It did not ask people merely to judge conduct. It asked them to fear contamination. The royal orders presented the Templars as men whose private rituals concealed monstrous beliefs and practices. The charges would soon be repeated with enough detail to horrify listeners. Denial of Christ, disrespect toward the cross, obscene initiation customs, secret idols, corruption hidden behind vows. Whether these accusations were true, exaggerated, extracted, or manufactured would become the central problem. But on that morning, the important thing was speed. The accusations moved faster than the defense. There is a cruelty in that kind of timing. The Templars were not given the chance to gather themselves as an institution before the crown struck. Their houses were raided. Their property was placed under royal control. Brothers who had lived under a rule of obedience suddenly found themselves isolated, questioned, and dependent on the mercy of officials who already possessed a script for their guilt. For many ordinary observers, the shock must have been profound. The Templars were familiar figures. Their estates stood in real communities. Their churches, barns, mills, and commanderies were part of local life. People may have resented them, admired them, borrowed from them, worked for them, prayed near them, or complained about their privileges. But to wake to the claim that this powerful order had been secretly corrupt at its spiritual core was not a small adjustment. It required people to reinterpret what had been visible for generations. And this is how public destruction often works. It does not merely remove an institution. It teaches people how to remember it. Philip's action forced a new reading of the Templars' past. Their secrecy now looked guilty. Their wealth looked impure. Their discipline looked like concealment. Their international structure looked suspicious. Their loyalty to the Pope looked less like religious privilege and more like dangerous independence. 1,000 ordinary details could suddenly be rearranged under one dark explanation. The operation also placed Pope Clement V in a difficult position before he had fully controlled the process. The Templars were not simply Philip's subjects in the usual sense. They were a religious order answerable to the papacy. In theory, judgment over them belonged to the church. But Philip acted first inside his kingdom, and by acting first he shaped the reality Clement would have to confront. This was one of the most important features of the arrest. Philip did not wait for a slow ecclesiastical investigation to determine whether the order should be seized. He created a crisis, then demanded that the church respond to it. The difference is subtle but enormous. Once the Templars were imprisoned, once confessions began to appear, once the charges circulated, the Pope was no longer dealing with a quiet complaint. He was dealing with a public scandal that threatened to embarrass the Church whether the accusations proved true or false. If true, the papacy had protected corruption. If false, the King of France had attacked a papal order under the banner of faith. Neither outcome was comfortable. The arrests also reveal something about medieval power that can be easy to miss. We sometimes imagine the Middle Ages as chaotic, governed by impulse and superstition alone. But the Templar operation shows a more unsettling reality. Royal government could be patient, written, synchronized, and legally framed. The paperwork did not soften the violence. It made the violence easier to distribute. A sealed order can travel where a king cannot. A formula can be copied. A command can be opened at the same hour in different towns. A local officer, holding royal authority in his hand, can transform suspicion into arrest before the accused even understands the scale of what is happening. There is nothing primitive about that. It is bureaucracy serving fear. For the Templars, the shock was not only physical, but spiritual. Their entire identity rested on obedience. Obedience to their rule, obedience to superiors, obedience to the church. When royal officers came in the name of Christian purification, resistance became complicated. To fight back might seem to confirm rebellion. To submit was to enter the machinery built to condemn them. Their vows, which had once made them formidable, now helped make them vulnerable. The brothers were trained to endure hardship, but not necessarily to survive the collapse of meaning around them. A battlefield is terrifying, but it is legible. An enemy charges, a banner falls, a command is given. Prison under accusation is different. There, the enemy is not only the man asking questions, it is the slow pressure to doubt whether anyone outside the room still believes you. Philip understood pressure. By striking everywhere at once, he reduced the chance of organized defense. By framing the arrests as religious duty, he made hesitation appear dangerous. By seizing property, he gained leverage. By producing accusations of extraordinary ugliness, he ensured that the public would discuss not the legality of the arrests first, but the alleged horror of what had been uncovered. That is why October 13th, 1307, should not be remembered merely as a dramatic date. It was a demonstration of narrative control. The king did not only capture bodies, he captured the opening scene of the trial in the public mind. From that morning onward, the Templars were forced to defend themselves from inside a story designed by their enemy. Every denial had to climb uphill. Every confession, however obtained, would slide easily into the shape already prepared for it. And the more the accusations spread, the harder it became for anyone, even the Pope, to separate truth from usefulness. The doors had been broken open. Now came the voices in the dark. Chapter 5. Confessions in the Dark. The accusations against the Templars were designed to do more than condemn. They were designed to disgust. That distinction matters. A charge of greed might anger people. A charge of disobedience might trouble church lawyers. But the claims made against the order reached into the deepest fears of medieval Christian society. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during initiation, spitting on or trampling the cross, exchanging obscene kisses, practicing secret forms of idolatry, and concealing rituals that turned their holy image inside out. The details varied from place to place, and that variation should make us cautious. Medieval trials for heresy often produced lists of accusations that grew more elaborate as they moved through interrogation rooms, rumor, and official repetition. Some charges may have come from hostile witnesses. Some may have been shaped by earlier anxieties about secretive groups. Some may have been sharpened by men who knew exactly what kind of story would sound unforgivable. What we can say with more confidence is that the accusations were not random. They attacked the Templars at the point where their public identity was strongest. The order honored the cross. The charges claimed they defiled it. The order served Christ. The charges claimed they denied him. The order lived under vows of discipline. The charges suggested hidden corruption beneath that discipline. The order was famous for brotherhood. The charges turned brotherhood into something secret, bodily, and shameful. This is why the scandal spread so effectively. The accusations did not merely say the Templars had failed. They said the Templars had been the opposite of what they appeared to be. And for any institution built on trust, that is the most dangerous accusation of all. But the real problem for historians begins not with the accusations themselves, but with the confessions that followed. Many Templars confessed. That cannot be waved away. The record contains admissions, sometimes detailed, sometimes partial, sometimes later withdrawn. A careful telling cannot pretend that everyone simply denied everything from the beginning. The difficulty is not whether confessions existed. The difficulty is how they were obtained, what they meant, and how much weight they can bear. Because in the darkness of medieval imprisonment, truth did not stand alone. It stood beside fear. Torture was used in the proceedings, especially under royal control in France. Men were placed under intense physical and psychological pressure. They faced isolation, humiliation, threats, exhaustion, and the possibility that denial could lead not to vindication, but to further pain. Some saw other brothers broken. Some understood that confession might offer a path to survival, or at least to a less immediate form of suffering. Some may have repeated what interrogators expected, because the shape of the answer had already been supplied. This does not mean every word in every confession was invented by someone else. Human beings under pressure are not machines. They may lie, remember poorly, exaggerate, submit, resist, bargain, or confess to one thing while denying another. Some may have believed that an initiation gesture, stripped from context and forced into hostile language, could be admitted as a technical act while not accepting the larger claim of heresy. Others may have confessed because terror made interpretation impossible. The important point is that torture does not simply reveal or conceal truth. It damages the conditions under which truth can be recognized. A confession produced under fear is not automatically false, but it is never clean evidence. It tells us something about the power of the interrogator, the vulnerability of the prisoner, and the story the authorities wanted confirmed. It may also tell us fragments of real practice, distorted through pain. The historian's work is to resist the temptation to choose the easiest answer, either that the Templars were innocent saints, falsely accused in every detail, or that every confession should be accepted as a window into a hidden cult. The reality is more uncomfortable. There may have been initiation practices within the order that outsiders did not understand, or that some brothers themselves experienced uneasily. Military and religious communities could use gestures of obedience, tests of humility, or harsh internal discipline that looked strange when dragged into court and described by hostile officials. But the leap from strange or improper customs to organized heresy is enormous. The evidence does not allow that leap without caution. And caution was not what Philip's campaign needed. A cautious investigation moves slowly. It separates claims. It checks consistency. It asks whether testimony given under pain matches testimony given freely. It allows room for ambiguity. A political prosecution needs something else. It needs a shape the public can grasp quickly. The Templar charges supplied that shape. They gave people images. Not abstract legal theories, but images almost impossible to forget. A knight spitting at the cross, a novice forced into humiliation, a secret idol in a closed chamber. These images entered the imagination with a force that sober denial struggled to undo. Once people can picture a crime vividly, they often begin to feel that the picture itself is a kind of proof. That is one reason scandal is so powerful. It does not merely persuade the mind, it occupies it. For the imprisoned brothers, the pressure became spiritual as well as physical. To confess heresy could endanger the soul. To deny under torture could endanger the body. To retract a confession later could bring the charge of relapse, a deadly category in heresy law. They were caught in a system where every movement could be turned against them, and the order's own ideals made the trap tighter. These were men trained to obey. Their lives were governed by rule, hierarchy, and submission. When interrogators, bishops, royal agents, and churchmen demanded answers, resistance was not a simple heroic gesture. It meant standing against authorities that medieval people had been taught to fear and respect. Even a courageous man could become uncertain when the world's moral architecture seemed to collapse around him. Some Templars did resist. Some denied the charges. Some later withdrew their confessions and insisted the order had been slandered. Others maintained admissions, whether from conviction, fear, calculation, or exhaustion. The record does not give us a single clean voice. It gives us a crowded, damaged chorus, and we have to listen without pretending the noise is clarity. The French proceedings were especially important because they set the emotional temperature of the case. Once confessions were obtained there, they could be used to pressure the papacy and influence opinion elsewhere. The fact that testimony had been extracted under harsh conditions did not stop it from becoming politically useful. In a crisis, useful evidence often travels faster than careful doubts. This is where the darker genius of the prosecution becomes visible. Philip's government did not need every Templar in Europe to confess freely and consistently. It needed enough admissions, from enough men, under conditions the public could be made to overlook, to make the order's innocence seem implausible. After that, the burden shifted. The question was no longer, has the Crown proven the full truth of these accusations? It became, how can such terrible accusations be ignored now that confessions exist? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. An institution can survive hatred. It can survive rumor. It can even survive investigation. What it struggles to survive is the moment when accusation and confession fuse into public certainty before the trial has reached a trustworthy conclusion. In the dark rooms where Templars answered their interrogators, the order's fate began to move away from evidence and toward reputation. The words spoken there, some frightened, some coerced, some possibly sincere, some later rejected, became the raw material from which destruction would be justified. And standing somewhere beyond those rooms, not yet able to escape the machinery around him, was the man whose own confession and retraction would come to define the final memory of the order. Jacques de Molay. Chapter 6. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. Jacques de Molay enters the story not as a young crusading hero, but as an old man carrying the weight of an institution already past its brightest hour. That is important. By the time the French crown moved against the Templars, de Molay was not leading fresh charges across the plains of the Holy Land. He was leading an order displaced from the world that had created it. The Crusader states had collapsed. Acre had fallen years earlier. The old geography of Templar purpose had narrowed into memory, strategy, and anxious proposals for future crusades that never quite became the rescue people imagined. De Molay had lived long enough to see the distance between legend and administration. He knew the order as a military brotherhood, but also as a network of properties, accounts, obligations, aging veterans, local houses, and political relationships that had to be managed with care. A Grand Master did not only command men in battle, he defended reputation. He negotiated with rulers. He answered criticism. He tried to preserve unity inside an organization that stretched across languages, regions, and interests. It is tempting to turn him into a symbol too quickly. The last Grand Master, the doomed witness, the man who would die in fire and become, in later legend, a voice of judgment against kings and popes. But before he became useful to memory, he was simply a person trapped inside a narrowing room of choices. He had reason to believe the church mattered. The Templars were not supposed to be judged like an ordinary association under royal control. Their authority came through papal recognition. Their privileges rested on papal protection. Their identity was woven into the church's larger project of crusading warfare and spiritual service. Whatever the French king wanted, de Molay could reasonably hope that the Pope would assert jurisdiction and slow the process enough for a proper hearing. That hope was not foolish. It was institutional logic. But institutional logic often fails when the political ground has already shifted. After the arrests, de Molay became more than a defendant. He became the most valuable voice the prosecution could obtain. If obscure brothers confessed, the scandal would spread. If local commanders confessed, the case would strengthen. But if the Grand Master himself admitted wrongdoing, even partially, the moral damage would be immense. His words would not be heard as the panic of a frightened man. They would be treated as the order speaking through its highest officer. This is the terrible burden placed on leaders in moments of collapse. Their personal weakness, confusion, or compromise becomes institutional evidence. A sentence spoken under pressure can outlive the conditions that produced it. De Molay did confess to some charges after his arrest, though the exact meaning and weight of that confession remain part of the difficulty. Later, he would retract. That movement, confession, reversal, uncertainty, renewed pressure, is not a tidy arc of cowardice turning into courage, or guilt turning into innocence. It is the behavior of a man caught in a machine designed to make stable truth almost impossible. We should be careful here. It is easy from a safe distance to demand perfect heroism from historical victims. We imagine the noble prisoner refusing every accusation, calmly enduring pain, speaking truth with the clarity of a courtroom speech. Real imprisonment is rarely so generous. Fear works on the body. Isolation works on the mind. The prisoner does not know what others have said. He does not know whether denial will save the order or doom his brothers. He does not know whether the Pope will intervene, whether the king has already won, whether the next answer will lead to mercy or to more suffering. De Molay's situation was made worse by obedience. He had spent his life inside a religious structure where submission to authority was a virtue. He was not trained to see every churchman, every legal officer, every royal demand as illegitimate. When the institutions that shaped your conscience begin accusing you, resistance does not arrive cleanly. It has to fight its way through habits of reverence, There is a human tragedy in that. He may have believed that admitting some improper practices, while denying true heresy, could protect the order from worse destruction. He may have hoped that cooperation would keep the matter within the Church and away from royal vengeance. He may have been exhausted, frightened, misled, or simply overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his world. The evidence does not allow us to enter his mind with certainty. What it does show is a man pulled between survival, duty, and the collapsing credibility of the institution he represented. For Philip IV, de Molay's vulnerability was politically useful. The king did not need the Grand Master to deliver a perfect theological self-condemnation. He needed enough to damage the order's public defense. Once the leader's voice could be associated with confession, the accusation gained a kind of gravity. It became harder for outsiders to say the whole affair was only slander. Yet the later retractions matter just as much. A retraction was not a safe gesture. In a heresy proceeding, taking back a confession could expose a man to the charge of relapse. It suggested that fear had spoken earlier, or that the accused was now defying the process. Either way, it was dangerous. For de Molay, the act of retracting did not restore the order. It did not undo the arrests. It did not erase the confessions already collected, but it changed the moral texture of the story. It introduced doubt where the prosecution needed finality. That doubt is why de Molay remains compelling, not because he offers us a simple answer, but because he embodies the instability of the whole case. Was he a guilty leader trying to save himself? A frightened old man broken by pressure? A loyal servant of the Church who expected justice and found politics instead? A commander too slow to understand that the battlefield had changed from warfare to narrative? The most honest answer may be that he was more than one of these things at different moments. Historical figures become easier to handle when we flatten them. Philip becomes greed. Clement becomes weakness. De Molay becomes martyrdom, but the past resists that kind of convenience. De Molay was a leader of a powerful order, not a harmless innocent pulled from nowhere. He belonged to an institution with wealth, secrecy, privilege, and enemies, but he was also subjected to a process in which power had already decided what kind of truth it wanted to hear. That tension makes him the human center of the mystery. The Chinon hearing, which still lies ahead in the story, would place de Molay before papal representatives and complicate the meaning of his guilt. But even before that secretive turn, his role reveals the shape of the crisis. The fate of the Templars was not decided only by documents, councils, and decrees. It was also decided in the fragile space between a frightened man's words and the uses powerful people made of them. De Molay could not save the order by silence. He could not save it by confession. He could not save it by trusting the normal channels of authority, because those channels had become part of the struggle. Every path available to him led deeper into contradiction. That is why his final years feel less like the fall of a commander and more like the slow closing of a legal and spiritual trap. He had spent his life serving an order built to defend sacred frontiers. In the end, the frontier he faced was invisible, the line between obedience and self-destruction, between confession and truth, between the church he served and the politics that surrounded it. And beyond that line stood Pope Clement V, trying to judge a case that had already been made dangerous by a king who refused to let it rest. Chapter 7. Clement V's impossible choice. Pope Clement V did not inherit a quiet throne. By the time the Templar crisis reached him, the papacy had already been bruised by conflict, pulled into the gravity of French politics, and forced to navigate a world where spiritual authority could no longer rely on distance alone. The Pope was meant to stand above kings in matters of faith. In practice, He had to deal with kings who had lawyers, armies, debts, ambitions, and very long memories. Clement's position is often described too simply. In popular versions of the story, he becomes either the weak pope who surrendered the Templars to Philip IV, or the cautious judge who tried, too late, to rescue justice from political violence. Neither portrait is completely satisfying. He was not free in the way a judge should be free, but he was also not irrelevant. His decisions mattered, and the tragedy is that every available decision carried damage. The Templars belonged directly to the authority of the papacy. That was not a decorative detail. It was central to who they were. Their privileges, their exemptions, their legal standing, and their spiritual legitimacy were tied to Rome's protection. If a secular king could arrest them, interrogate them, seize their property, and define their guilt without papal control, then the issue was larger than one order. It touched the dignity of the Church itself. Clement understood this. He could not simply accept Philip's action as though the king had arrested a group of ordinary criminals. The Knights Templar were a religious order. Their fate, by rights, belonged to ecclesiastical judgment. But Philip had already acted. That was the trap. The Pope did not receive a calm petition asking him to investigate suspicious practices. He received a crisis that had been made public before it had been made safe. Templars were already imprisoned. Confessions had already begun to circulate. The French crown had already framed the affair as a defense of Christianity. By the time Clement tried to assert control, the story had momentum. Momentum is not evidence, but it often behaves like evidence in public life. If Clement moved too strongly against Philip, he risked looking as if he were protecting heretics, or at least protecting an order whose own members had confessed to horrifying acts. If he accepted Philip's case too quickly, he allowed royal power to dominate papal jurisdiction and possibly condemn men through procedures shaped by fear. If he delayed, the scandal festered. If he defended the order, the Church might be seen as shielding corruption. If he abandoned it, the Church would be helping destroy one of its own creations. There was no clean path through this. The accusations themselves made calm judgment almost impossible. Heresy was not merely a legal category. It was a spiritual emergency. A pope could not treat charges of denial of Christ, defilement of the cross, and secret idolatry as minor administrative concerns. Even if he doubted the methods used to obtain confessions, he could not ignore the content of those confessions once they existed. The ugliness of the charges forced a response. Yet Clement also had reason to distrust the process. The sudden arrests had been ordered by a king with obvious interests. Torture had shaped testimony. The seizure of property made the prosecution look conveniently profitable, and the political history between France and the papacy gave the whole affair a bitter aftertaste. When a financially strained crown discovers a spiritual emergency inside a wealthy order it already wishes to control, a careful mind should hesitate. Clement did hesitate. That hesitation can look like weakness, and perhaps some of it was. But hesitation can also be the last refuge of a man who sees that every confident answer is dangerous. He was trying to preserve papal authority without openly provoking a king who had already shown how far he could go. He was trying to investigate without allowing the investigation itself to be swallowed by French pressure. He was trying to separate sin from scandal, confession from coercion, and the guilt of individuals from the survival of an entire institution. Those distinctions were essential. They were also politically inconvenient. A legal mind might ask, did some brothers commit improper acts? Did certain initiation customs exist? Were they symbolic humiliations, distorted by hostile interrogation, or signs of true heresy? Did the leadership know? Did the order officially teach anything contrary to the faith? Could the entire institution be condemned if the evidence against it was inconsistent and extracted under fear? These are careful questions. Philip's campaign did not depend on careful questions. The king needed the scandal to remain whole. The more the case was divided into degrees, contexts, and uncertainties, the less useful it became as a weapon. A nuanced result might punish individuals, reform the order, or place it under closer papal supervision. But nuance would not deliver the full political victory that suppression could offer. Nuance would not fully break the Templars' independence. Nuance would not cleanse the public imagination in one decisive stroke. Clement therefore faced not only a legal case, but a battle over how complicated the truth would be allowed to remain. That is one of the most revealing aspects of the Templar affair. The evidence was messy. The political need was simple. Messy evidence asks for patience. Simple political need asks for conclusion. When those two forces meet, institutions often choose language that hides the mess. Clement's personal situation deepened the difficulty. The papacy of his time was increasingly entangled with French influence. Clement himself was a French pope, and his relationship with Philip could not be separated from the pressures surrounding his office. This does not mean every decision he made was dictated by the king. It means his freedom was constrained by geography, dependence, diplomacy, and the memory of what had happened when a pope clashed openly with French royal power. He also had to think beyond the Templars. A pope does not judge one crisis in isolation. He must ask what the decision will do to the Church's credibility, to relations with rulers, to the stability of religious orders, to the authority of canon law, and to the fragile trust of believers. If the Templars were publicly restored after such accusations, could their reputation ever recover? If they were condemned without sufficient proof, what did that say about justice under the Church? Even absolution, if it came, would not solve everything. A man might be forgiven spiritually and still be politically ruined. An order might be cleared of formal heresy and still be judged too damaged to continue. A pope might believe the leaders were not heretics in the deepest sense, yet still fear that the name Templar had become impossible to defend. That distinction feels cold, but it may be close to the heart of the mystery. The issue was not only whether God could forgive, it was whether Europe could forget. And Europe, once scandal had entered its imagination, was not inclined to forget. Clement's impossible choice was therefore shaped by two courts, the court of canon law and the court of public belief. In the first, evidence, procedure, repentance, and jurisdiction mattered. In the second, images mattered more. Knights spitting at the cross, secret rites, confessions whispered under pressure. A wealthy order now stained beyond easy repair. Philip had forced the Pope to judge inside both courts at once. That is why Clement remains such a difficult figure. He was not the architect of the original strike, yet his authority helped determine its final meaning. He did not create the accusations, yet he had to decide what the Church would do with them. He may have recognized flaws in the case, but recognition is not the same as power. Knowing that a process is compromised does not automatically give a ruler the strength to undo it. And so, the story moved toward a quieter, more private moment. Not a public spectacle, not a royal raid, not a roaring accusation, but a hearing behind controlled doors where the Grand Master and other leaders would face papal commissioners. There, at Chinon, the record would preserve something the public story could not easily absorb. Not innocence, not vindication. Something more troubling. Forgiveness inside a machine of destruction. Chapter 8. The Secret Hearing at Chinon. There are moments in history when the most important room is not the one filled with spectators. It is the smaller room, the controlled room, the room where fewer voices are allowed in, where the language becomes careful, where the fate of public events is quietly adjusted by men with seals, authority, and reasons to be cautious. Chinon was such a place. In 1308, after the first shock of arrests, accusations, and confessions, several leading Templars were examined by papal commissioners. Among them was Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master whose words had already been bent into the larger struggle over the order's guilt. This was not a royal spectacle staged for the streets of Paris. It was a papal inquiry, and that difference matters. The Templars, after all, were not supposed to belong finally to Philip IV. However much he had done to seize the first move, the order's deepest legal identity remained tied to the Pope. Clement V had to know whether the accusations reached the center of the order, whether its leaders had knowingly embraced heresy, and whether the confessions already gathered under French pressure could be trusted as the foundation for a final judgment. The hearing at Chinon did not erase the scandal. It did not restore the Templars. It did not open the prison doors and return the white mantles to their former dignity. Its importance is quieter than that. According to the surviving record now known as the Chinon Parchment, Clement's representatives heard the Templar leaders, received their statements, and reconciled them to the Church. The crucial point is not that every accusation vanished. It is that the leaders appear to have been granted absolution from the charge of heresy after acknowledging wrongdoing and seeking forgiveness. For a story often remembered as a simple exposure of a corrupt order, this is a deeply inconvenient detail. Absolution is not the same thing as innocence. That must be said carefully. A person can be absolved after confession, repentance, and penance. Forgiveness does not prove that nothing improper happened. It does not mean the Templars were spotless. It does not mean the papal court found every charge invented. Medieval religious law was more subtle than the clean categories later storytellers prefer. But absolution does mean something. It means the matter was not being treated, at that moment, as the final confirmation that these leaders stood outside the Christian faith beyond repair. It suggests that Clement, through his commissioners, did not see de Molay and the others simply as unrepentant heresiarchs leading a secret anti-Christian cult. The spiritual question, at least for these men, seems to have been answered in a way that allowed reconciliation, and that creates the central fracture in the official memory. If the leadership could be reconciled to the Church, why did the order continue moving toward suppression? That question is powerful because it does not require us to invent a hidden treasure chamber or a secret doctrine buried under the altar. The contradiction is already strong enough. The Church's private handling of the leaders appears more forgiving than the public destruction that followed. The record does not shout conspiracy. It whispers inconsistency. For Clement, Chinon may have offered a narrow legal path. He could preserve the possibility that the Templar leaders were spiritually recoverable while still investigating the wider order. He could acknowledge failures, sins, or improper practices without accepting the full royal narrative of organized heresy. He could try to pull the case back into papal hands after Philip had forced it into public crisis. But politics does not always allow narrow paths to remain open. By 1308, the case had already escaped the quiet world of legal distinction. Confessions had circulated. The French king had invested his authority in the accusation. The Templar name had been stained before witnesses could be weighed with care. Even if Clement believed the leaders could be absolved, the larger question remained. Could the order survive the scandal created around it? That is where Chinon becomes more than a document. It becomes a mirror held up to institutional fear. The parchment reveals a church trying to manage two realities at once. In one reality, there were souls to judge, confessions to interpret, penance to assign, and leaders who might be forgiven. In the other, there was a public institution whose reputation had been damaged so severely that its continued existence threatened to prolong scandal. A spiritual answer could be merciful. A political answer could still be fatal. Modern readers often struggle with that distinction because we expect a legal finding to produce a public result. Innocent, released. Guilty, punished. But medieval power was not so clean, and perhaps modern power is not either. Institutions do not always act according to the simplest truth available to them. They act according to what can be defended, what can be survived, and what can be explained without destroying the authority of everyone involved. Chinon suggests that Clement may have known the Templar case was not as simple as Philip needed it to be. That does not make Clement heroic. It makes him interesting. He was not standing outside the storm with perfect courage. He was inside it, trying to preserve papal judgment without provoking a political rupture he may not have been able to win. The parchment shows not a pope triumphantly clearing the Templars, but a papacy quietly complicating the case in a way the public story would later smooth over. There is something almost bureaucratically tragic about that. A parchment is written. A decision is recorded. Men are absolved. The document is preserved, misplaced, obscured, or simply left where time can cover it. Meanwhile, the public machine continues. Councils are prepared. Pressure builds. The name of the order becomes heavier and harder to defend. The legal texture remains tangled, but memory prefers a straight road. For Jacques de Molay, Chinon may have offered a brief opening. He had been heard by papal representatives. His relationship to the Church was not necessarily severed in the way the harshest accusations implied. He could still imagine, perhaps, that the Pope would distinguish between the sins of men and the destruction of the order itself. That hope would prove fragile, because the question was no longer only whether the Grand Master could be forgiven. It was whether the Templars, as an institution, had become too dangerous to preserve, even if their leaders were not condemned as irredeemable heretics. This is the heart of the mystery, and it is less theatrical than legend would like. It is not about a secret code on the parchment. It is about the difference between what authority can admit privately and what it is willing to say in public. The Chinon parchment survived as a record of that difference. It tells us that beneath the great public story of accusation and collapse, there was another layer, quieter, more cautious, less useful to propaganda, a layer in which guilt could be partial, confession could be compromised, forgiveness could be granted, and destruction could still continue. That is why the parchment matters. Not because it solves the Templar mystery, but because it prevents the mystery from becoming too simple. Chapter 9. Innocent enough to forgive, dangerous enough to destroy. There is a difference between being forgiven and being restored. That difference is where the Templar story becomes most uncomfortable. The Chinon hearing appears to show that Jacques de Molay and other senior leaders were reconciled to the Church. They were not simply treated as monsters beyond spiritual repair. The record suggests something more measured. They confessed certain failings, received absolution, and were brought back into communion. In a religious sense, that mattered profoundly. But the order did not survive. This is the contradiction that refuses to stay buried. If the leaders were absolved, why did the process continue toward suppression? If the Pope's own representatives could forgive, why could the public institution not be preserved? Why did mercy in private not become mercy in policy? The answer lies in the cold space between sin and scandal, A sin can be confessed. A soul can be absolved. A penitent man can be returned to the church after repentance. But an institution is not a soul. It has a name, a public function, a reputation, property, enemies, defenders, habits, and political meaning. By the time Chinon happened, the Templar name had become more than a religious order's title. It had become a problem that every powerful figure needed to solve. For Clement V, the question was no longer only, are these men heretics? It had become, can this order still exist without damaging the church that protects it? That is a much harsher question. It allows for a strange outcome. The men may be forgiven, while the institution is judged impossible to save. Not because every charge has been proven in the cleanest legal sense, not because the prosecution has answered every doubt, but because the order's continued survival would keep the wound open. Every Templar house would become a reminder of the accusations. Every restored privilege would invite outrage. Every attempt to defend them would raise the same terrible images again. In that environment, reputation became a form of evidence, or at least a substitute for it. This is not justice in its purest form. It is institutional survival, and survival often has a language of its own. The Church could forgive repentant men without publicly declaring that Philip's campaign had been a monstrous abuse. The Pope could avoid fully endorsing the king's version of events, while also avoiding a direct confrontation that might humiliate the French crown. The order could be removed without a straightforward declaration that its central leadership had been knowingly and irredeemably heretical. To modern ears, this sounds like evasion. In many ways it was, but it was also a method of navigating danger. Clement faced a case in which every conclusion threatened someone's authority. If he declared the Templars innocent as an order, Philip's arrests, torture, and seizures would look like a grave assault on the Church's own institution. If he declared them guilty in the strongest sense, the papacy would be admitting that one of its most famous orders had concealed spiritual corruption for generations. If he punished only individuals and preserved the order, the scandal might never end. So the result drifted toward a fourth option: suppress the institution without making the judicial condemnation as clean as Philip might have wanted. This is the gray heart of the affair. The Templars were not saved by the weakness of the case against them, because the case had already become bigger than evidence. They were not fully condemned in the way later legends sometimes imply, because the official process remained more tangled than the public imagination remembered. They were caught between being spiritually forgivable and politically unbearable. There is a lesson here that reaches beyond the medieval world. When an institution becomes associated with scandal, the truth of individual guilt may no longer decide its fate. Authorities may ask whether the institution can still perform its function, whether people will trust it, whether defending it costs more than destroying it, whether enemies have turned its name into a permanent liability. These questions are not the same as justice, but they often stand close enough to borrow its clothing. The Templars' tragedy is that their enemies understood this before their defenders did. Philip IV did not need every accusation to withstand perfect scrutiny. He needed the order to become impossible to defend cleanly. Once that happened, even papal hesitation could serve the movement toward suppression. Doubt, which should have protected the accused, instead made the order look unstable. Complexity, which should have slowed judgment, made public restoration harder. This is one of the quiet cruelties of political trials. Ambiguity does not always help the victim. Sometimes it helps the power that has already acted. The Chinon parchment, therefore, does not reverse the story in the simple way some might wish. It does not allow us to say, the Templars were innocent and everyone knew it. That would be too easy and too careless. The order may have had troubling initiation customs, Some brothers may have committed acts that were improper, humiliating, or spiritually dangerous. Some testimony may preserve distorted fragments of real practice. The evidence cannot be wiped clean by one document, but the parchment does weaken the neatness of the official destruction. It suggests that the highest level of the Church could distinguish between guilt and heresy, between confession and permanent exclusion, between the sins of leaders and the total meaning of an order. That distinction did not save the Templars, but it tells us something essential. The men directing the process may have seen more uncertainty than the final public story allowed. And once we see that, the fall of the Templars stops looking like a simple moral cleansing. It looks like a controlled demolition of a damaged institution. The word damaged matters. Institutions can be destroyed because they are guilty. They can also be destroyed because they are useful targets. Often, most dangerously, they are destroyed when both things are partly true in ways no one wants to separate. A flaw becomes a lever. A rumor becomes a weapon. A confession becomes a verdict long before anyone has agreed what the confession means. That appears to be what happened here. The Templars' wealth made them tempting. Their independence made them inconvenient. Their secrecy made them vulnerable. Their confessions made them defenseless. And the papacy, pressured by politics and scandal, found itself holding a distinction too subtle for the public crisis Philip had created. Forgiven men do not necessarily regain power. A forgiven leader may still be removed. A forgiven institution may still be dissolved. A forgiven name may still be too stained to speak without embarrassment. Spiritual absolution can restore a soul, but it cannot always repair a public identity once that identity has been made poisonous. This is why the phrase, innocent enough to forgive, dangerous enough to destroy, captures the tension better than either innocence or guilt alone. It does not claim the Templars were pure victims. It does not accept Philip's accusations at face value. It points to the middle ground where power often does its most effective work. The Templars could be treated as repentant Christians in one room and as an intolerable institution in another. The parchment survived because someone recorded the first reality. The suppression would continue because the second reality had become more useful. From this point forward, the fate of the order moved toward a gathering where law, diplomacy, fear, and reputation would be folded into one solemn decision. The language would be formal. The setting would be ecclesiastical. The result would be devastating. And still, even there, the final judgment would not be as simple as the legend later made it sound. Chapter 10. The Council of Vienne. The end of the Knights Templar did not arrive as a thunderclap. It arrived through a council. That may sound less dramatic than arrests before dawn or confessions forced from frightened prisoners. But this is where the story becomes most revealing. Public destruction often prefers ceremony. A decision made under pressure can be dressed in robes, sealed in formal language, and placed within a setting that makes the outcome appear inevitable. By the time the Church gathered at Vienne, the Templars had already been wounded almost beyond recovery. The question was whether law would heal the wound, examine it, or cover it with something that looked like resolution. The council opened under the shadow of a case that had become too large for ordinary judgment. Philip IV wanted the order gone. The accusations had spread. Confessions, many of them compromised by torture and fear, hung over the proceedings. Pope Clement V had to manage the scandal without allowing it to shatter the appearance of papal authority. The bishops and churchmen who gathered were not walking into a clean courtroom. They were walking into the aftermath of a political strike that had already shaped what could be said publicly. That is why the Council of Vienne matters. It did not simply judge the Templars in the way later summaries sometimes imply. It became the place where uncertainty was converted into administrative finality. There were voices that resisted a simple condemnation. Some argued, in effect, that the order should be allowed a proper defense. That point should not be passed over too quickly. It tells us that the evidence was not universally treated as sufficient for straightforward conviction. The Templar case remained difficult, even for those who lived inside the assumptions of medieval religious law. The problem was not merely that modern readers are uncomfortable with the process. Some contemporaries also saw that the road to condemnation was uneven. But Philip's pressure did not fade. The French king had already committed himself to the Templars' destruction. His authority, and the authority of his officials, was tied to the claim that the order represented a terrible spiritual danger. A retreat would have been more than embarrassing. It would have raised questions about arrests, seizures, interrogations, and the entire royal campaign. Once a ruler builds a public case around moral emergency, backing away can look like confessing abuse. So the pressure remained on Clement. The Pope had to find a solution that ended the scandal without necessarily proving every accusation to the highest standard. This is the key to understanding what followed. The Templars were not preserved. They were not fully vindicated, but their suppression came through a path that avoided the cleanest form of judicial condemnation for proven heresy. The order was abolished by papal provision, not simply sentenced after an ordinary trial in which guilt had been conclusively established. That distinction can feel technical, but it changes the meaning of the story. A judicial condemnation says, in effect, the accused has been tried and proven guilty. A suppression by papal authority says something different. Whether or not the full legal case has reached that level, the institution is being removed for the good of the Church, the protection of faith, and the restoration of peace. This was not mercy for the Templars. It was a controlled ending. In 1312, Clement issued the decree known as Vox in Excelso. The language was solemn, cautious, and heavy with concern for scandal. It did not present the matter as a simple triumph over proven heresy in the way a royal propagandist might have preferred. Instead, it moved through the logic of reputation, danger, and necessity. The order by then was judged too compromised to continue. Here the Church did something both powerful and evasive. It ended the Templars without giving the world the clean verdict that the evidence had fully earned their destruction in the strongest judicial sense. The result satisfied the need for closure, but it preserved the ambiguity that still troubles the case. This is why the fall of the Templars cannot honestly be told as a simple story of guilt followed by punishment. The formal suppression itself suggests that the authorities were navigating around problems in the evidence. If the case had been perfectly clear, if the order had been proven as an institution to be deliberately and officially heretical, there would have been less need for this careful route. The very caution of the decree is part of the evidence, but caution did not save the order. By the time law began speaking in measured tones, the practical fate of the Templars had already been decided. Their name was damaged, their leaders were imprisoned, their property was under dispute, their brothers were scattered, frightened, or discredited. The institution could no longer function as it once had, even if some within the Church doubted the full royal version of the charges. There is a grim realism in that. Sometimes a legal process does not discover a result. It manages one that politics has already made likely. The Council of Vienne also shows how institutions protect themselves through phrasing. The Church had to avoid saying too much in either direction. It could not declare the Templars innocent without implicating the French crown and making its own earlier handling look disastrous. It could not fully embrace the ugliest charges without admitting that papal protection had sheltered corruption for generations. So the language of suppression worked like a veil. It allowed the order to disappear while leaving the deepest contradiction unresolved. This does not mean the council was meaningless. It mattered enormously. It gave the destruction a formal shape. It moved the affair from crisis to decree. It transformed a contested prosecution into official reality. After Vienne, the Templars were no longer a wounded order awaiting possible rescue. They were an abolished order whose memory would be fought over by others. And yet, what was not said is almost as important as what was said. The council did not give us the satisfying clarity of a final courtroom scene. No perfect unveiling. No single document that makes every witness consistent, every confession reliable, every political motive irrelevant. Instead, it left behind the uneasy outline of an institution sacrificed to scandal, pressure, and the fear that continued debate would harm the Church more than suppression. That is why Vox in Excelso feels less like a verdict carved in stone than a door being closed before the room has been fully searched. For Philip, the outcome was a victory, though not perhaps in the purest form he might have desired. The Templars were gone. Their independence was broken. Their symbolic power was shattered. But the papal method of suppression left traces of hesitation. The king got the result. The record kept the discomfort. For Clement, the decree may have seemed like the least disastrous path. He could end the scandal, preserve some measure of papal initiative, and avoid a direct war over the legal soul of the case. But the cost was immense. A religious order born from crusading devotion was dissolved without the clean public proof that would have made its destruction morally simple. And moral simplicity is exactly what the Templar story never gives us. At Vienne, the Church did not say, plainly and finally, that every dark accusation had been proven beyond serious doubt. It also did not restore the order and denounce the campaign against it. It chose removal. It chose quiet finality over open contradiction. It chose the peace of an ending over the danger of a more honest uncertainty. The result was devastatingly effective. The Templars ceased to exist as an order. Their seal, their hierarchy, their privileges, and their public mission were taken from them. What remained were imprisoned leaders, disputed assets, local brothers trying to survive the consequences, and a name that had become available for legend. Because when institutions close a case without resolving its contradictions, they do not always bury the mystery. Sometimes they preserve it. Chapter 11. The wealth that changed hands. When a religious order is destroyed, its ideas may be argued over for centuries. Its property must be handled immediately. This is the less romantic side of the Templar story, but it is also one of the most revealing. Once the order was suppressed, Europe did not simply pause in reverent uncertainty and ask what the lost brothers had truly believed. Officials had to decide who would take possession of the commanderies, estates, mills, fields, rents, treasure, livestock, buildings, account books, and rights that had once sustained the Templar network. The fall of the order produced a very practical question. If the Templars no longer existed, who inherited the body they left behind? In theory, the answer was not supposed to be Philip IV. The Templar properties had been given over generations for religious purposes, especially the defense of the Holy Land and the wider crusading mission. These were not ordinary private estates to be absorbed cleanly into a royal treasury. Many donations had been made by people who believed they were supporting sacred warfare, charity, prayer, and the protection of Christian pilgrims. To simply hand everything to the French crown would have made the whole prosecution look almost embarrassingly convenient. The Church needed a more defensible solution. So much of the former Templar property was assigned to the Hospitallers, another major military religious order. On paper, this made sense. The Hospitallers shared a crusading purpose and already had an established structure capable of receiving and managing land. If the Templars had been removed because their name had become impossible, then their resources could still be redirected toward a similar sacred mission. It was a neat solution. Neat solutions in history usually hide a struggle. The transfer was not smooth everywhere, and it did not erase the appetite of rulers. Property does not float above politics simply because a decree says it should. Local authorities, royal officials, creditors, bishops, nobles, and rival institutions all had reasons to inspect the remains closely. Some wanted reimbursement for the costs of imprisonment and administration. Some claimed rights or debts. Some had already taken control during the crisis and were not eager to return what had become useful. In France, the problem was especially sharp. Philip's men had seized Templar assets at the beginning of the arrests. Years had passed. Revenues had been collected. Expenses had been claimed. By the time the formal redistribution was ordered, the French crown had already been living with its hands on the machinery. This is where the question of motive becomes difficult. It would be too crude to say the entire Templar affair was only about money. The politics were broader. The conflict with papal authority mattered. The fear of scandal mattered. The order's ambiguous reputation mattered. But it would be equally naive to pretend that wealth was a background detail. The Templars possessed exactly the kind of wealth a king in financial strain could not help noticing. Organized, visible, legally protected, and morally vulnerable once accusation began. The prosecution did not need to be invented from greed alone for greed to benefit from it. That is an important distinction. History rarely offers villains who announce their motives in clean categories. Philip could believe, or say he believed, that he was defending the faith. His lawyers could frame the arrests as holy necessity. Officials could repeat accusations with solemn conviction. And still, the material consequences could serve royal power so neatly that suspicion becomes unavoidable. Money leaves footprints where ideology prefers mist. The transfer to the Hospitallers also reveals the difference between abolishing an order and abolishing its function. The Church did not decide that military religious property had become illegitimate. It did not reject the entire idea of armed religious service. It rejected the Templar institution, its name, its structure, its compromised reputation, while trying to preserve the usefulness of its resources. The properties could be cleansed, so to speak, by being given a new institutional identity. This was practical. It was also symbolic. A Templar commandery under the Red Cross had become suspect. The same land under another order could be made acceptable again. The buildings might remain. The revenues might continue. The local peasants might still pay rents. The fields might still be harvested. What changed was the story attached to the property. That is one of the quiet powers of institutions. They can rename continuity. For people living near former Templar houses, the change may have felt less like an ending than an administrative transformation. A seal changed. A superior changed. A legal title changed. Perhaps a building was repurposed or a brother replaced. But the economic life around the property did not vanish into legend. It continued in ledgers, disputes, inspections, and negotiations. This is where the popular imagination often drifts away from the historical record. Later stories loved the idea that the Templars hid vast treasure just before their arrest. Wagons slipping into the night, fleets disappearing, chests of gold spirited away to secret guardians. Such legends are not impossible in every tiny detail. Institutions under threat can move valuables, but the evidence for grand treasure fantasies is thin. Much of the Templar wealth was never in portable heaps of gold. It was in land, rights, rents, buildings, harvests, animals, debts, and administrative control. A field cannot be smuggled onto a ship. A mill does not vanish into a coded manuscript. This does not make the wealth less important. It makes it more historically interesting. Landed wealth is slow wealth. It feeds power over time. It anchors influence in communities. It produces income year after year. That kind of wealth was precisely why the Templars mattered, and why their destruction required careful redistribution. The treasure was not only what could be hidden in a chest, it was the network itself. And networks are harder to steal cleanly than coins. The Hospitallers inherited much, but inheritance came with friction. Some properties were damaged, depleted, contested, or burdened by claims. The costs of taking over former Templar assets could be heavy. Local officials might resist. Royal governments might delay. The legal process could stretch. What looked on a papal decree like a simple transfer became, in practice, a long argument over possession. This tells us something about the aftermath of scandal. Destruction creates opportunity, but also mess. Those who break an institution may discover that its remains are complicated. Every estate has neighbors. Every rent has a payer. Every building has records. Every confiscated object has someone ready to claim that it was theirs, or should be theirs, or has already been spent on necessary expenses with impressive paperwork to prove it. There is a faintly dry comedy in that, though not a cheerful one. After years of accusations about secret idols and obscene rites, much of the aftermath came down to the medieval equivalent of property management disputes. The apocalypse, once processed by officials, often becomes an inventory. Yet the inventories matter because they show what the public drama was partly covering. The Templars had been a spiritual symbol, but also an economic organism. Suppressing them meant redirecting the lifeblood of that organism. It meant deciding which powers would lose, which would gain, and which would pretend that the transfer had always been orderly. For Philip, the final distribution was not a complete, uncomplicated seizure of everything he might have wanted. The papal decision to give Templar property to the Hospitallers limited the appearance of naked royal plunder. But the French crown still benefited from the years of control, from claimed expenses, from political victory, and from the destruction of an independent institution within the kingdom. Sometimes the greatest gain is not what lands in the treasury permanently, but what rival power is removed from the map. The Hospitallers gained assets, but also inherited a shadow. The Church preserved the argument that sacred property remained devoted to sacred use. The French crown could say the dangerous order was gone. Everyone with authority could claim a version of necessity. The dead order, of course, could claim nothing. Its brothers had been judged, imprisoned, released in some cases, punished in others, or left to live under suspicion. Its leaders remained trapped in the machinery that had outlived the institution itself. Its name was now separated from its property, and that separation is a kind of second death. First, the order was suppressed. Then its material memory was reassigned. But property can be transferred more easily than meaning. The estates could change hands. The revenues could be redirected. The seals could be replaced. Yet the question left behind by the Chinon parchment and the suppression at Vienne did not pass so neatly to the Hospitallers or to the crown. It remained attached to the empty space where the Templars had stood. If the order was too compromised to survive, was that because justice had revealed its corruption, or because politics had made its survival impossible? The wealth changed hands. The contradiction did not. Chapter 12. The fires of 1314. By 1314, the Knights Templar no longer existed as an order in any meaningful public sense. Their properties had been reassigned. Their name had been officially suppressed. Their brothers had been judged in different ways across Europe, some punished, some absorbed into quieter lives, some left carrying a stain that no decree could fully wash away. The institution had been taken apart piece by piece, not only by accusation, but by time. Yet two men still remained at the center of the unfinished story. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, and Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, had survived long enough to become living evidence of the unresolved case. As long as they remained alive, silent and imprisoned, the authorities could treat them as remnants of a closed matter. But living men can still speak, and speech, at the wrong moment, can reopen what power has tried to seal. Their final public appearance was meant to complete the process. They were brought forward to hear judgment. The expectation seems to have been controlled humiliation, not renewed drama. After years of proceedings, after confessions and retractions, after papal hesitation and royal pressure, the surviving leaders were to receive their sentence. The order was gone. The men would be confined. The case would pass into administrative memory. That was the intended shape of the ending. But de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay disrupted it. At the moment when their submission would have confirmed the story built around them, they retracted their confessions and defended the order's innocence. Not innocence in the sense that no Templar had ever sinned, failed, or participated in questionable practices. The claim was larger and more dangerous, that the order itself had been falsely condemned, that the admissions used against it had not reflected the truth, and that the men speaking now would rather face death than continue to support a lie. We should be careful not to make this scene too polished. Later memory has loved to frame de Molay's final stand as perfect martyrdom, the old Grand Master rising before corrupt powers, speaking with clean defiance, sealing the Templars forever in legend. Reality was probably rougher, more hurried, more human. He was an aging prisoner after years of pressure. The legal process around him was complex. His exact words come to us through later accounts, not through a calm recording made for modern certainty. Still, the act itself mattered. To retract a confession in a heresy case was extremely dangerous. A person who confessed, was reconciled, and then withdrew that confession could be treated as a relapsed heretic. In the logic of the time, relapse was not a technical inconvenience. It could lead to death. De Molay and de Charnay would have understood, at least broadly, that their words placed them beyond the safer path of imprisonment. This is what gives the moment its force. Their retraction did not save them. It could not restore the order, recover the property, undo the council, or erase the years of testimony already gathered. In practical terms, it achieved almost nothing. In symbolic terms, it changed everything about how the fall could be remembered. A defeated leader who dies quietly in prison becomes a footnote to the decree that destroyed him. A defeated leader who publicly rejects the confession used to justify that destruction becomes a problem for the official story. His death does not prove his innocence, but it prevents his confession from remaining simple evidence of guilt. That is why the fires of 1314 burn so brightly in the imagination. Philip IV moved quickly. The two men were condemned as relapsed heretics and burned in Paris. The execution was public enough to matter, final enough to end the immediate danger, and violent enough to leave an image that later generations would not easily abandon. The last Grand Master of the Templars did not disappear into an archive. He died in flame, under the authority of a kingdom that had pursued his order to extinction. The scene has often been painted in dramatic colors: the river, the crowd, the king's justice, the old knight facing death. Some of that atmosphere belongs to later storytelling, and we should not mistake every legend for a witness. But the core fact is severe enough without embellishment. Men who had once led one of Christendom's most powerful religious orders were executed after retracting the very confessions that had helped condemn them. That retraction did not make the Templars innocent. It made the case unfinished. There is a difference. If de Molay had maintained his confession calmly to the end, later defenders of the order would have had a harder task. They could still point to torture, politics, and papal ambiguity, but the final image would have been of omission. Instead, his last act gave memory a counterweight. Against the documents of accusation stood the spectacle of a man withdrawing his own words at the cost of his life. For Philip, the execution removed the living challenge. For the Church, it closed an embarrassment that had already become nearly impossible to explain cleanly. For the public, it offered something more emotionally powerful than a decree, a death that looked like testimony. This is how legends begin, not from invention alone, but from an unresolved moral shape. A man retracts, a king burns him. Within months, powerful figures connected to the affair also die, and later generations begin arranging coincidence into curse. The human mind dislikes unfinished justice. It reaches for patterns. It wants the dead to answer. It wants the guilty to tremble. It wants history to behave like a courtroom where the final verdict is eventually spoken by fate. But fate is not evidence. The real force of de Molay's death lies not in supernatural revenge, but in the way it exposed the fragility of the official resolution. The order had been suppressed, yet its last Grand Master died insisting that suppression had rested on falsehood. Whether he spoke from perfect truth, desperate conscience, or a final refusal to carry shame into death, his words made the clean version harder to believe. In that sense, the fire did not erase him. It preserved him, not as a flawless saint, and not as proof of every legend later attached to the Templars, but as the human face of a contradiction that documents alone can feel too cold to carry. The Chinon parchment troubles the legal memory. De Molay's final retraction troubles the moral memory. Together, they suggest that the fall of the Templars was never simply an investigation reaching its proper end. It was a destruction that still needed silence afterward. And in Paris, in 1314, the silence failed. Chapter 13. The Curse, the Legend, and the Convenient Myth. After Jacques de Molay died, the Templars became much harder to control. Living institutions can be arrested, interrogated, dissolved, and stripped of property. Dead ones behave differently. They move into rumor. They become symbols. They are taken up by people with grievances, fantasies, political needs, religious longings, and a taste for stories in which the defeated are secretly stronger than their destroyers. The Knights Templar, once suppressed, entered that strange second life. In the years and centuries that followed, their story gathered layers. Some were understandable, some were imaginative, some were useful. A curse, supposedly spoken by de Molay from the flames. Hidden treasure spirited away before the arrests. Secret survivors guarding forbidden knowledge. Lost relics, mysterious fleets, connections to later movements and underground traditions. The more distant the real order became, the more flexible it grew in the hands of legend. That is not unusual. History dislikes empty spaces, and the Templar case left many of them. There were unanswered legal questions. There were contradictory records. There were confessions shaped by torture and later retracted. There was papal absolution preserved quietly in the Chinon record, followed by institutional suppression. There was property redistributed, but not always cleanly. There was the image of the last Grand Master dying after withdrawing his confession. These are exactly the kinds of fragments from which later myth can build a cathedral. The curse is the most dramatic example. According to later accounts, de Molay summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to face divine judgment after his death. The story became irresistible because both men did, in fact, die not long after him. Clement died in 1314. Philip died later that same year. To a medieval or early modern imagination, the pattern was almost too tempting. The condemned man speaks, the powerful fall. Justice, denied in court, returns through heaven. It is a strong story. That does not make it reliable history. The evidence for the curse as a literal final speech is thin and tangled with later tradition. We should not treat it as a transcript from the execution. Public deaths often attract memorable last words, especially when the dead man later becomes a symbol. The more morally satisfying a final statement sounds, the more carefully it should be handled. History is full of dying speeches improved by people who were not standing close enough to hear them. And yet the curse survived because it answered an emotional need. The official process had not given people a clean moral ending. The Templars had been accused, partially confessed, partially absolved, suppressed without a straightforward judicial condemnation of the whole order for proven heresy, and finally represented by a leader who died retracting his confession. That is not the kind of ending that lets the mind rest. The curse repaired the shape. It made the story feel balanced. A king destroys an order. A pope allows it. The last Grand Master calls them to judgment. They die. The pattern is so elegant that it almost warns us against believing it too quickly. But legends do not have to be factual to be meaningful. The curse tells us less about what de Molay said and more about what later generations wanted his death to mean. They wanted the destroyed order to possess moral power after losing earthly power. They wanted a sign that political violence had not gone unnoticed. They wanted history to punish those whom law had failed to restrain. The treasure legends worked differently. They turned loss into possibility. If the Templars had been destroyed, perhaps they had not truly been defeated. Perhaps their wealth had escaped. Perhaps their secrets had been carried away before Philip's officers arrived. Perhaps somewhere, beneath a castle, inside a hidden chamber, or across the sea, the order's real inheritance survived. This is where romance often overwhelms reality. The Templars certainly had wealth, but much of it was not the kind that disappears conveniently into moonlit wagons. Their strength lay in land, rents, buildings, rights, farms, mills, and administrative networks. Some movable valuables may have existed, of course. Any wealthy medieval institution possessed objects, coin, documents, and liturgical goods, but the grand image of a vast treasure vanishing intact belongs more securely to later imagination than to firm evidence. A hidden chest is more exciting than a disputed rent roll. A secret fleet is easier to sell than a transfer of agricultural property to the Hospitallers. This is not just a joke about human taste, though human taste has a great deal to answer for. It reveals how legend simplifies power. The real Templar wealth was embedded in systems. It operated through trust, privilege, geography, and management. That kind of power is difficult to dramatize, so the myth turns it into gold. The same pattern appears with claims of secret knowledge. Later stories often imagine the Templars as guardians of forbidden wisdom, occult rites, or world-changing relics. Some of these tales borrow the atmosphere of the Order's early presence near the Temple Mount. Some draw on the secrecy of Templar initiation. Some grow from the strange accusations made during the trials. Once an institution has been accused of hidden rituals, later storytellers can easily reverse the charge. Perhaps the hidden thing was not corruption, but sacred truth. That reversal is attractive because it rescues the Templars from humiliation. Instead of men broken by torture and politics, they become keepers of mysteries too dangerous for kings. Instead of a wealthy military order caught in the machinery of royal and papal power, they become protagonists in a secret history beneath ordinary history. The legend gives them grandeur. It also risks taking away their real tragedy, because the darker truth is not that the Templars definitely possessed some supernatural secret. The darker truth is that they may not have needed one to be destroyed. That is a more disturbing idea. It means an institution could be brought down by debt, resentment, fear, political calculation, religious anxiety, and the strategic use of scandal. It means torture could produce words that outlived pain. It means a pope could privately reconcile leaders and still publicly remove the order. It means the machinery of respectable authority could do what legend later attributed to hidden forces. The convenient myth protects us from that. If the Templars were destroyed because they guarded an earth-shattering secret, then their fall belongs to a world of grand conspiracies. But if they were destroyed because they were rich, vulnerable, politically inconvenient, and reputationally damaged, then the story belongs much closer to ordinary power. That version is less glamorous, but it is harder to dismiss. The curse, the treasure, and the secret knowledge all perform the same quiet service. They make the story feel less bureaucratic and more enchanted. They turn confiscation into mystery, legal ambiguity into prophecy, and institutional suppression into a battle between hidden orders. They give later audiences a way to admire the Templars without looking too long at prison cells, coerced confessions, and property transfers. But the real mystery does not need embellishment. The real mystery is why the official story became cleaner than the evidence, why forgiveness did not prevent destruction, why an order could be spiritually recoverable and politically doomed, why the documents that complicated the case remained so much less famous than the legends that simplified it. That is where the Templar story still has power. Not in the certainty of a curse, but in the unease that made people invent one. Not in a treasure hidden from the French crown, but in the visible wealth that changed hands under the cover of sacred necessity. Not in a secret doctrine passed through the centuries, but in a public warning about how institutions can be ruined when suspicion becomes useful. The legend may have grown larger than the event itself, but it grew from a wound that was real. And wounds, when poorly explained, have a way of becoming myths. Chapter 14. What the Church did not say aloud. The most dangerous documents are not always the ones that reveal a secret plot. Sometimes they are the ones that reveal a hesitation. The Chinon parchment did not burst into the modern world carrying proof that the Knights Templar had been framed in every detail. It did not prove that the order guarded an occult treasure, or that its leaders possessed some forbidden knowledge capable of frightening kings and popes. In some ways, its message is less theatrical and more damaging than that. It shows that the official story had been made cleaner than the reality. For centuries, the broad public memory of the Templars moved along a simple road: accusation, confession, suppression, execution. It was easy to retell because it had a moral shape. The order was accused of monstrous corruption. Its members confessed. The Church acted. The last leaders died. Later, legends grew in the cracks. But Chinon complicates the road. It suggests that, behind the formal collapse, papal representatives dealt with the senior Templar leaders in a way that does not match the image of men condemned as hopeless enemies of the faith. They were questioned. They confessed certain acts or failures. They sought reconciliation. They appear to have received absolution. The parchment preserves not a dramatic rescue, but a distinction. The leaders could be spiritually forgiven even as the institution moved toward disappearance. That distinction is exactly what the public story could not easily carry. Public narratives prefer clarity. A dangerous order is condemned. A guilty man is punished. A righteous authority acts. But the actual process contained a far more troubling mixture. Coerced testimony, political pressure, papal jurisdiction, damaged reputation, spiritual reconciliation, and institutional destruction. These pieces do not fit neatly together, so memory trimmed the edges. The Church did not need to announce every discomfort aloud. To say too much would have been dangerous. If Clement V had publicly emphasized the absolution of the Templar leadership, Philip IV's campaign would have looked less like holy justice and more like royal aggression wrapped in theology. If the Pope had fully endorsed Philip's darkest interpretation, the Chinon record would make that endorsement appear unstable. If he had restored the order, the scandal might have continued to poison the Church's authority. If he had condemned it with complete confidence, the problems in the evidence would not disappear. So the safer path was controlled silence, not total silence. Decrees were issued, councils met, property was assigned, sentences were carried out. The machinery spoke often, but it did not speak with full honesty about the contradiction at the center of the case. It did not say plainly, "These men may be reconciled to the Church, and yet their order may still be too politically ruined to survive." It did not say, "The evidence is compromised, but the scandal has become unmanageable." It did not say, "The truth here is less useful than an ending." That is what Chinon allows us to hear beneath the official language. The parchment is not a key that opens every locked door. It is more like a loose thread in a carefully repaired garment. Pull it, and the pattern begins to show its seams. The destruction of the Templars was not a single act of judgment. It was a layered process in which different forms of truth were kept apart. There was sacramental truth. Had these men sinned, confessed, and been absolved? There was legal truth. Had the order been proven guilty as an institution? There was political truth. Could any ruler afford to let the Templars survive after such accusations? There was reputational truth. Would the Christian public ever trust the name again? These truths did not produce the same answer. That was the problem. A soul might be saved. A legal case might remain uncertain. A king might demand victory. A pope might need closure. A public might remember only the most horrifying images. The Church's final handling of the Templars tried to hold those tensions without admitting how heavy they were. This is why the Chinon parchment matters more as evidence of discomfort than as evidence of conspiracy. A conspiracy asks us to imagine a hidden master plan. Discomfort asks us to examine something more common and more believable. Institutions making decisions they cannot fully justify in public, then preserving only the language that makes those decisions appear orderly. That is often how power protects itself. It does not always burn the inconvenient record. Sometimes it files it away. It lets the more useful version circulate. It allows time, distance, and repetition to do what fire would have done too obviously. A document may remain physically intact while its meaning disappears from public memory. The Templar case was especially vulnerable to this kind of smoothing because everyone had something to lose. The French crown needed the order to remain guilty enough to justify the arrests, torture, seizures, and political triumph. The papacy needed the outcome to seem like a responsible act of spiritual government, not capitulation under pressure. The Hospitallers needed to receive the property without appearing to profit from injustice. Local authorities needed the aftermath to become administrative, not explosive. Even ordinary believers needed a story they could live with. because the idea that sacred institutions had been manipulated by power was far harder to absorb than the idea that a corrupt order had been removed. So the simpler story survived, and yet the parchment survived too. That is the strange irony. The official memory had mass, ceremony, and repetition on its side. It had decrees, executions, property transfers, and the authority of institutions. The Chinon record had something quieter: persistence. It remained as a witness to a version of events that did not fit the moral theater built around the order's fall. It does not ask us to adore the Templars. It does not ask us to deny that the order had become wealthy, secretive, privileged, and politically exposed. It does not ask us to pretend every accusation was invented from nothing. What it asks is more disciplined. Do not confuse suppression with proof. Do not confuse confession with truth when fear has shaped the room. Do not confuse forgiveness with restoration. Do not confuse an official ending with a resolved case. That is the final secret preserved at Chinon. Not a hidden idol. Not a map to treasure. Not a message from some underground brotherhood. A contradiction. The Church appears to have known that the Templar leaders could be treated as repentant Christians, yet the order was still allowed to vanish. The public story required the disappearance to feel morally necessary. The private record suggests it was more complicated, and perhaps more compromised, than that. In the end, the parchment does what good evidence often does. It narrows the fantasies and deepens the unease. It takes away the easy thrill of occult invention and replaces it with a harder question about authority, reputation, and fear. What the Church did not say aloud was not that the Templars were secretly innocent heroes. It was that the truth was not clean enough for the ending that power required. Chapter 15. The Erasure That Failed. The Templars were destroyed, but they were not successfully erased. That is the quiet irony at the end of the story. Philip IV could arrest bodies. The Church could suppress an order. Property could be reassigned, seals broken, titles removed, and the last Grand Master reduced to ash. On paper, the work was done. The institution that had once stretched across Europe was gone. But an ending is not the same as control. The Templar affair survived because its contradictions survived. The order was accused of crimes so severe they seemed to demand extinction. Yet the evidence was compromised by torture, political pressure, and the obvious convenience of the target. Its leaders were treated, at Chinon, as men who could be reconciled to the Church. Yet the order they led was still judged too damaged, too dangerous, or too inconvenient to continue. Its wealth was redirected toward another military order, but not before royal hands had shaped the process. Its final Grand Master confessed, retracted, and died in a way that made silence impossible. No single piece proves a grand hidden conspiracy. Together, they reveal something more familiar and more unsettling. Power managing a problem it could not afford to explain honestly. This is why the Chinon parchment matters at the end. Not the beginning alone. It is not a magical document that turns the Templars into innocent saints. It is a surviving objection to simplicity. It reminds us that official memory often works by compression. Messy cases become clean stories. Uncertain evidence becomes confident judgment. Political necessity becomes moral language. What cannot be comfortably said aloud is left in records few people will read. For a time, that may be enough. Institutions are very good at outlasting outrage. They have procedures, archives, formulas, ceremonies, and the patience of stone. They know that most people cannot live forever inside complexity. A public wants an answer. A ruler wants a result. A church wants peace. A scandal must end somewhere. So the Templars were given an ending. But documents have their own form of patience. They do not argue. They do not defend themselves. They wait. A parchment can remain quiet for centuries and still disturb the verdict when it is read again. It can carry a distinction that propaganda had no use for. Forgiven but suppressed. Reconciled but ruined. Not cleanly condemned, yet permanently removed. That is the unresolved tension the story leaves behind. Were the Templars guilty of every monstrous charge made against them? The evidence does not support such certainty. Were they entirely innocent victims of a fabricated case? That too is too easy. The order had power, secrecy, wealth, and internal practices that could be questioned, distorted, or feared. What can be said more carefully is this. Their destruction was not the simple triumph of truth over corruption. It was the result of a collision between accusation, fear, debt, authority, reputation, and survival. In that collision, justice became difficult to separate from usefulness, and usefulness won. Perhaps that is why the Templars never fully left history. Not because they held the world's greatest secret, but because their fall exposed one. Not an occult secret, but a political one. That institutions can destroy in the name of order, forgive in private, condemn in public, and hope the difference will not matter. But sometimes it does matter. Sometimes the record remains. The Templars lost their lands, their name, and their future. Jacques de Molay lost his life. Clement lost the chance to leave behind a clean moral judgment. Philip won the battle he needed to win, but not complete command over how it would be remembered. The erasure failed because the story still does not close neatly. It leaves us with a parchment, a fire, a council decree, and a question that refuses to become legend or verdict alone. Were the Templars destroyed because they were guilty, or because they had become impossible to defend? The honest answer may be the most uncomfortable one. They were destroyed in the space between the two, and that space is where history often hides its darkest work.